Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Wayback, welcome to Wayback Wednesday. Joe's gonna ramble. But first, we have to do a shout out. Today we're doing a random name picker. Ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Let's see who's in the magical. It is Good Cemeteries. Okay, Good Cemeteries Gone Bad. This is a fun little one. Walking around cemeteries, ghost stories of haunted cemeteries. They film Cemetery Adventures and share it on YouTube. This is a cool channel. They're only a little over 600, so check them out. Like, share, comment, and have a good day.
All right. This is the Bearded Historian for the Bud Files. Now, last week we had mentioned that we were going to look at some of the more poignant military blunders. Jared did put up a suggestion that I'll need to reach out to him, and Sue said she'll pass a message on to him, so we're looking forward to getting that information. For this week, I had been digging up a little bit of information about Nazi Germany in World War II. And the big thing to think about with Nazi Germany is that, you know, even for a country that blundered repeatedly, it was kind of scary how much of Europe they were able to overtake on a number of reasons. Most poignantly was that several of the countries that they wound up fighting weren't ready for a Second World War. They were still hunkering down with the old-fashioned methods of attrition, dealing with things like trench warfare, thinking that, you know, lined fortifications would be a way to go about conflict. And they also were holding on to the hope that by what had been signed at the end of World War I, and the pretty much taking the teeth out of the German army would be enough to prevent them from having a Second World War. Well, as things started out, you know, when Nazi Germany came to power before World War II, a lot of the things that would happen was the country started arming up, but part of their advantage was that they were able to use the Spanish Civil War kind of as a testing ground for things like aircraft, for tanks, ships. And what wound up happening is that they were able to get those vehicles prepared, readied, and mass production started up big time in Germany. One thing also is that around that same time, a lot of the country, in fact a lot of the world, was dealing with an economic depression. Here in the United States, we had the Great Depression through most of the 30s, dealing with both unemployment. The economy was really bad. There was the Dust Bowl, which rendered a lot of farmland just about useless. But then our country started finding a way to come together with some of the programs that Roosevelt put together, FDR in his time as president. But it seems like nothing really motivates a country into, you know, getting out of a depression like war. You think about how, you know, here in the States, you know, while the men were out busy fighting on the front lines, we were building tanks and planes and ships with the women who were still here. Granted, the United States didn't actually enter the war until late 1941 and didn't really see a lot of action until after Pearl Harbor, but Germany, they were already starting to build and arm up back in, 37, 38, and then finally when all war broke out with their invasion of Poland, a lot of their forces, had gotten a chance to test out new effects, new theory, new defense abilities. The offensive idea of blitzkrieg turned out to be a real shock to a lot of countries. In fact, when Poland went down so quickly, there were a lot of people that were like, well, of course, they did it to the Polish, but, France will be able to stop them. The English coming across the English Channel and setting up the British Expeditionary Force, they'll be able to stop them. It turned out to not be quite the case. Now, for all the success Germany had with their initial operations, it hit a few problematic areas. One of the first problematic areas was the fact that Germany did not have a real healthy supply of oil. I mean, if you were to import oil from, the oil fields down by Palesti, if you were to try to get some of the oil out of, down by Libya that the Italians had, one of their biggest problems they had keeping their panzers rolling was oil production. In fact, they went out and they had to build large factories for their production of synthetic oil. And that was both time-consuming, costly. Of course, Germany had no problem with using conscript labor for production or manufacturing because, well, they didn't care much for the cost of human life. Now, a second problem that Germany had, and this is both, you can look at it as a two-edged sword, okay? To get Germany riled up, first of all, he had to find a bad guy, and that's where their attention turned to the Jewish people, which is kind of a cruel thing to say, but that's where their focal point was. But here's the thing that's really crazy if you think about it. A lot of the German scientists who fled Hitler were the same ones that helped us develop the bomb. Had Hitler not gone after the Jewish people that way, who knows? They might have had the bomb first. There's been a lot of talk about how Norway had the production of heavy water, and had a certain submarine not been sunk, they might have had their chance at the bomb first. Now, as things go along, one of the other key pieces of this whole mess that Germany got themselves into, before major wars started, Hitler had done two things. One was really smart, one was really dumb. The first one was the making of an alliance with Italy. Okay, at the time, there was times that Italy was in its effort to try to make the new Roman Empire by invading near defenseless positions down in Africa. Don't get me wrong. On paper, it looks like they've got all this terrain. In reality, it wasn't that hard. But then Italy decided that they were going to try and invade Albania and then into Greece. And the Greeks kicked their butts. So all of a sudden, Germany, who, half the time was looking at going across the channel, had to go and help out Mussolini. It turned out to be quite a mess all the way down to the airborne landings off of Crete and a number of other operations in the Mediterranean. Interestingly enough, one island, I think that if they would have taken out Malta, Granted, it would have been a real hard course of action, but if they would have taken out Malta, all of a sudden, all the operations in Africa for supplying, for moving equipment, all of that for the British in Africa would have pretty much come to a standstill. They would have been stuck a lot more than they originally were, and Germany would have had an easier time getting to another set of oil fields in the Middle East, because then they could have gone across the Suez Canal and through Palestine. Now, another side of the issue was that, Germany and Russia signed a non-aggression pact, and to their benefit, it worked out really well, because they cut Poland right in half. They didn't have to deal with each other on that front. They were, on nice, speakable, peaceful terms. And then Germany could focus on the rest of Europe over with France. They didn't have to do anything with Spain, because Spain decided to pretty much sit neutral, although they were pro-Nazi. Pretty much the only thing on mainland over here in Europe was all the way down to Gibraltar, and that ain't very big. But that little stretch with the English Channel, there's a lot of people that think that by Hitler not taking England out, if you would have thought about how much that of a repercussion would have been, you take England out of World War II, and America has a real problem resupplying forces. They have a problem invading Europe in general. They would have difficulty keeping the supply line with the Lend-Lease over to Russia intact, because it made a good stopping point and a good staging area eventually when we had D-Day, and also when we wound up making the jump from the U.S. over to Algeria, and there were other forces from England that would invade and keep the Germans busy in Libya and parts of Algeria. And so a lot of that all tied to the fact that Hitler made the big mistake right there. Now, depending on who you talk to, the historians have a fun time with this, but one of the biggest things was when Germany declined, not only to go after the UK, but Russia, the Soviet Union, Poland. Poland was one thing. Going after Russia, even Napoleon had a problem there. Granted, Napoleon got to Moscow. He found it burned to the ground, and he lost a good portion of his men in the effort, but it wasn't really that much of a victory, because, a lot of his men wound up buried in the ground out there. Now, Hitler, when he decided he was going to take the shot and go after the Soviet Union, there were parts of it that he did that actually worked out really well. He had a timetable, he had targets, and he was making good forward progress. His mistakes, though, and some of the generals would later on admit the problems weren't the generals, it came from above. Hitler all of a sudden started getting these wild, ambitious ideas. Let's take and split off our forces from, instead of taking out, going after Leningrad outright and, capturing it, he decided he was going to starve it to death. He thought, I'll surround it, I'll cut off all the access, and I'll let the Russian winter kill them. Fortunately, he forgot that Russians live there, so they know what the cold's like. Granted, they still had, cases of cannibalism strike, and the Russian people found ways to resupply the besieged city. They got within, I think it was 16 miles of Moscow. They got the Tula. I mean, you could hear the cannons. The only problem is that by that time, the Soviet Union had disassembled and moved their factories back to the Urals. And so any capture that they would do around Moscow would have been an empty victory. Their third attempt, their third big effort, was a push on Stalingrad. And to me, I think this was pretty much just an ego trip. Because the idea was that, well, if he could capture Stalingrad, he could have Joseph Stalin's, name in lights pretty much captured. And the irony of it is, from what I remember, they captured 90% of that town. 90%. And they still couldn't make it a complete victory. Because that was about the same time that the Soviet Union started using mass populations to basically bleed the Germans out of ammunition. They would send guys across the river with guns without bullets in them because they wanted the Germans to waste all their ammunition. Now, we'll go ahead and rewind here for a few months, okay? The first time they were in that area, okay, if they would have gone south during that initial expansion and started going further past Crimea, Sevastopol, and gotten into the Caucasus, there was oil down there. And all of a sudden, these tanks that were up here starting to run dry, this would have been a major changing point. But instead, he got caught up with these secondary targets. Now, another item, and this one's always been a fun point, especially with the military people in mind. Hitler and the Germans had jet power long before they ever started building, the Me-262. The problem is that they wanted a bomber. They wanted something that could have range ability, not speed for the purpose of shooting down bombers. And so, here's this wonderful idea for jet aircraft, but they weren't allowed to mass produce it. Imagine if the Germans had the Me-262, the first jet-powered fighter, in 1942. Would we have been bombing Berlin? Would we have been bombing Aachen? Would we have been bombing Dresden? No, because they would have been shooting our bombers out of the sky without any problem. They would have been downing Lancasters. But instead, Hitler and his ability to interfere with production of a good thing, it cost them. Some of their other more creative methods was they built a tank called the Maus, or Moss, if you want to call it properly in German. Great tank. If the world was paved in concrete, 3 feet thick. It was so heavy, its max speed, you could walk past it. But, in his grand idea of making things bigger, heavier, and larger. Now, don't get me wrong, there were times that heavy artillery and, the usefulness of some of these things came into play. When Germany had to get into the Crimea. Crimea was lined with fortresses and forts. And to get into those things, literally, the German conscripts had to lay down rails to move these guns up into position. And then, they had a crew behind them to move up the ammunition. It was a nice, simple, methodical fort, but eventually they broke into those key targets. Of course, what's crazy is when it took Germany, I think, a month to capture one key city, and the Germans recovered it in less than a week, that's a sign that something was definitely going wrong. Now, the other moment here. Okay. Now, the last key item that, and it goes back to the fact that, he treated the Jewish people so badly. And, again, they needed a focal point. They needed something to drive home, something to irritate and get the German people riled up. Now, had he taken some of the people that were captured, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians. A lot of these people had just gotten taken over by the Soviet Union, and they weren't thrilled by the concept. But had Hitler actually, embraced these people, showed them a new free world, and gave them a chance at a respectable life, he might have had a source of population that, was willing to fight for him. But Germany was bent on this idea that Germans were the master race. And thus, a lot of these other groups, the Ukrainians, it was kind of interesting because there were Ukrainians that worked with Germans. There were Ukrainians that turned into partisans. It wasn't just France, and it wasn't just, some of the smaller low country nations that fought behind the lines and, were helping pilots escape. The Ukrainians, a lot of them paid for their nationality by being hanged, being firing squads. If Hitler would have, at least tried to work with some of these people, they might have had better luck. In fact, it's kind of scary to think if Hitler would have been able to turn the tide in World War II. But thankfully, we never had to learn that lesson the hard way. And Hitler wound up meeting his end via a bit of self-help in a bunker in Berlin with his mistress at his side. And it basically touched off the Cold War. But this has been our little touch into classic military blunders. We'll look to see what we've got coming up for next week, and you folks have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.